Two girls walked into the Texas summer and never came home. Their laughter vanished somewhere between the Galveston shore and the marsh, where bones were found months later. A confession emerged. A conviction followed. But then the officers who extracted that confession were arrested for bank robbery. Another man confessed from behind bars, claiming he killed 11 girls, including these two. He died without charges. The first man died insisting innocence. The case, once closed, is now open. The truth was never buried. It was drowned in doubt. What really happened on that August day in 1971? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The Texas Gulf Coast stretched wide and humid under the August sun, a landscape where heat bent the air and salt water mixed with marsh. On August 4, 1971, two teenage girls walked along the Galveston beach with bare feet and easy smiles, their voices rising above the crash of waves. Rhonda Renee Johnson was 14. Sharon Lynn Shaw would turn 14 in less than 2 weeks. They were friends, neighbors, ordinary, in every way that mattered. The afternoon passed in sunlight and laughter. Witnesses later remembered seeing them leave the beach area voluntarily, walking together, no signs of distress. That was the last confirmed sighting. By evening, when porch lights flickered on and dinner tables waited, neither girl returned home. Parents made phone calls, friends were questioned, routes were retraced. The hours became night, and night became fear. Missing persons reports were filed with the local police. Their names appeared in newspapers the next morning. Neighbors organized search parties. Days passed with no answers. The girls had simply vanished. As August turned into September, hope thinned. Rhonda's family kept her bedroom untouched. Sharon's mother spoke to reporters, pleading for information. The community responded with urgency at first. Volunteers combed through fields, walked along bay roads, searched abandoned structures. Flyers with school photos were taped to storefront windows and telephone poles. But leads dissolved into dead ends. No witnesses came forward with credible sightings. No evidence surfaced. The investigation stalled. Detectives worked with what little they had, but without physical evidence or eyewitness accounts, the case became another open file in an understaffed department. Families called the police station daily, desperate for updates. Each time the answer was the same, nothing new. The girl's disappearance became a wound in the community, a question mark that hovered over every conversation. Parents held their daughters closer. Schools sent home letters urging caution. The warm Texas nights felt different now, laced with unease. Autumn arrived quietly, and with it came the slow, crushing realization that Rhonda and Sharon might never come home. Winter passed in cold silence. The search continued, sporadically, driven more by guilt than hope. Fishermen kept their eyes open near the marshlands. Hunters reported anything unusual they found in the woods, but the Texas Gulf Coast was vast, a sprawling mix of water, mud, and hidden places where secrets could sink without a trace. Families held onto fragile threads of possibility. Maybe the girls had run away. Maybe they were being held somewhere. Maybe they would still walk through the door. But those threads frayed with each passing week. The case file grew thinner, not thicker. Detectives moved on to other investigations. The community's attention shifted. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, though the absence of two young girls remained a haunting presence. By the time 1972 arrived, the case had become a quiet tragedy, spoken of in hushed tones, but no longer front-page news. The families still waited, still hoped, but the world around them had begun to move on. The breakthrough came not from investigation, but from chance. In early 1972, two boys were fishing near Clear Lake, a murky stretch of water bordered by reeds and marshland, close to Taylor Lake and Galveston Bay. They were casting lines when one of them noticed something pale, bobbing near the surface. At first they thought it was debris, an old buoy maybe, or a piece of driftwood. But as they moved closer, the shape took form. It was a human skull. The boys scrambled to shore and contacted authorities. Within hours, police tape surrounded the area. Investigators waded into the shallow water, recovering the skull and searching the surrounding marsh. Dental records confirmed what families had feared for months. The skull belonged to Sharon Lynn Shaw. Wrapped around part of a jawbone was a small cross necklace, one Sharon had worn every day. The discovery was both heartbreaking and undeniable. The missing persons case became a homicide investigation. Search teams returned with dogs, divers, and equipment. Days later, additional skeletal remains were found nearby, consistent with two adolescent girls. Rhonda and Sharon were dead. The community reacted with grief and rage. Vigils were held, church services filled with mourners. The local newspapers published stories every day, demanding answers. Parents who had clung to hope now faced the unbearable truth. Detectives worked around the clock, processing the scene, cataloging evidence, interviewing anyone who might have information. But the remains offered little. There was no soft tissue, no clothing to analyze, no clear cause of death. The skeletal condition and the environment where the bodies were found meant that forensic analysis could only confirm identity, not how the girls had died. The investigation shifted focus to finding who had done this. Tips flooded the police station, some credible, most not. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how thin. The pressure was immense. The families needed justice. The community needed answers. The department needed closure. And then a name surfaced. A city councilman approached investigators with a tip, pointing them toward a local gas station attendant named Michael Lloyd Self. The councilman claimed Self had made suspicious comments, displayed unusual behavior. It was enough to bring him in for questioning. Michael Lloyd Self was 24 years old, living in the Clear Lake and Webster area. He worked at a gas station, lived alone, kept to himself. Neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable. When detectives knocked on his door, he seemed nervous but compliant. He agreed to come to the station for an interview. The interrogation lasted hours. The police chief and a deputy led the questioning, pressing Self on his whereabouts in early August, asking about the girls, demanding explanations. The details of what happened in that room remained contested, but by the end of the session, Self had provided a written confession. In it, he admitted to killing Sharon and Rhonda. However, the confession contained shifting narratives. In one version, he described strangling the girls. In another, he mentioned striking one of them with a Coca-Cola bottle. The location where he claimed to have disposed of the bodies did not match the site where the remains were actually discovered. Clothing disposal details contradicted what little physical evidence had been recovered. But the confession existed, signed, and the momentum of the investigation moved in one direction, toward prosecution. Detectives treated the confession as the breakthrough they needed. Despite inconsistencies, it provided a narrative, a suspect, and a path to trial. Self was arrested and charged with the murder of Sharon Lynn Shaw. The case against him relied heavily on his written statement. Physical evidence was minimal. Forensic analysis of the remains could not definitively establish cause of death. No murder weapon was recovered. No witnesses placed Self with the girls on August 4th. But the confession anchored the prosecution's strategy. Families of the victims were informed, relief mixed with sorrow. They wanted justice, but they also wanted certainty, and the inconsistencies in Self's statement left unease in the air. The defense attorney began preparing a counter-argument, focusing on contradictions and the possibility of coercion. But the legal machinery was already in motion. The trial date was set for May 1973. Media coverage intensified. The courtroom would become the stage where truth and justice were supposed to converge. But convergence requires clarity, and clarity was the one thing this case lacked. The trial opened in May 1973 to a packed courtroom. Families of the victims sat in the front row, faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Reporters filled the back benches, notebooks ready. The prosecutor stood confidently, outlining the case against Michael Lloyd Self. His opening statement was clear. Self had confessed to murdering Sharon Shaw, and that confession would prove his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense attorney rose next, arguing that the confession was inconsistent, contradictory, and potentially coerced. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the mismatched locations, and the absence of any witnesses. The judge presided with calm authority, managing objections, ruling on motions, and guiding the proceedings. Over the following days, the prosecutor presented the confession in full, reading Self's words aloud to the jury. Detectives testified about the interrogation. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, highlighting every inconsistency. He questioned the methods used during the interrogation, suggesting pressure and manipulation. But no alternate suspect was presented. No other theory was offered. The jury heard only one story. Michael Lloyd Self confessed, and confessions carry weight. After days of testimony, the case went to the jury. Deliberations lasted hours, not days. When they returned, the verdict was read: guilty of the murder of Sharon Lynn Shaw. Self was not convicted for Rhonda Johnson's death due to insufficient evidence linking him specifically to her. The courtroom erupted in muted reactions. Relief from some, tears from others. The families embraced, though the victory felt hollow. One girl's death had been answered. The other remained legally unresolved. Self stood silently as the judge delivered the sentence. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. As he was led away, he maintained his innocence, quietly but firmly. The trial ended, but the questions did not. The community debated the outcome in diners and churches. Some believed justice had been served. Others felt uneasy, troubled by the gaps in the evidence. The case was closed in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of those who had followed it closely, something remained unfinished. The truth felt more like a compromise than a revelation. Michael Lloyd Self filed appeals almost immediately. His defense attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that the interrogation methods violated his rights, and that the inconsistencies in his statement should have rendered it inadmissible. Appeal after appeal moved through the courts. Each time, judges reviewed the record, examined the arguments, and upheld the original conviction. The confession was deemed voluntary. The trial was ruled fair. The legal system had spoken, and it would not reverse itself. But outside the courtroom, doubt grew louder. Advocacy groups began examining the case, noting the reliance on confession without corroborating physical evidence. Legal scholars cited it as an example of the dangers inherent in confession-based convictions. Years passed. Self remained behind bars, insisting he had been wrongly convicted. His story became part of a broader conversation about justice, truth, and the fallibility of the legal process. Then, in a twist that shattered what little certainty remained, a scandal erupted that changed everything. The police chief and the deputy who had led Self's interrogation were arrested. The charges had nothing to do with the murder investigation. They were accused of committing bank robberies. Both officers were tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison. The revelation exploded across headlines. The same men who had extracted Self's confession, who had testified in court about their methods and findings, were felons. The integrity of the investigation collapsed under the weight of corruption. Defense attorneys seized on the news, filing new motions and habeas corpus petitions. If the officers who obtained the confession were criminals, how could the confession be trusted? The community reeled. Public opinion, once divided, now tilted sharply towards skepticism. Families who had believed in the conviction began to question. Activists demanded a review. The case that had seemed resolved was now fractured, its foundation cracked beyond repair. Self's legal team pushed harder, arguing that the conviction should be overturned. But the courts moved slowly, and time continued to pass. In 1992, a federal judge reviewed Self's habeas corpus petition, examining claims of coercion, misconduct, and constitutional violations. The hearing lasted weeks, with testimony from legal experts, former investigators, and advocates. The defense attorney presented a compelling case, arguing that the corruption of the officers involved tainted every aspect of the original investigation. The prosecutor countered, asserting that despite the officers' later crimes, the confession had been thoroughly examined during the original trial and found voluntary. The federal judge listened, deliberated, and ultimately ruled against Self. The earlier findings that the confession was voluntary were upheld. The conviction stood. Self remained in prison. The ruling devastated those who believed in his innocence. It also deepened the divide within the community. Some felt the legal system had protected itself rather than pursued truth. Others believed that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Self continued to maintain his innocence, writing letters, speaking to journalists, and refusing to accept the narrative that had been built around him. But his voice grew quieter as the years dragged on. In 1998, a new and disturbing chapter opened. Edward Harold Bell, already incarcerated for other crimes, began writing letters to prosecutors across Texas. In those letters, he confessed to murdering multiple teenage girls along the Gulf Coast region, spanning years and locations. He called them the 11 that went to heaven. Among the names he listed were Rhonda Renee Johnson and Sharon Lynn Shaw. The letters were chilling, detailed, and specific. Bell described patterns of abduction, methods of disposal, and locations that matched unsolved cases. Investigators reopened files, cross-referencing his claims. With evidence, some detectives believed him. His confessions aligned with patterns of disappearances in the region, including cases that had never been solved. But belief was not proof. Bell provided no physical evidence, no corroborating details that could be independently verified. His statements were disturbing, but insufficient for charges. Prosecutors reviewed his letters carefully, but without forensic links or witnesses, they could not move forward. The case against Bell remained hypothetical, a confession without consequence. The families heard the news and felt the wound reopen. Was Self innocent? Was Bell the true killer? Or were both stories incomplete? The public response was immediate and polarized. Documentaries began featuring the case, exploring the possibility that the wrong man had been convicted. Journalists interviewed Bell in prison, recording his statements, his tone calm and disturbingly matter-of-fact. He spoke of the girls as if recounting a trip to the store, emotionless and detached. Some investigators who had worked the original case expressed doubt about Bell's claims, noting that convicted offenders sometimes confess to crimes they did not commit, seeking attention or notoriety. Others believed Bell was telling the truth, pointing to the specificity of his statements and the geographic overlap with known disappearances. The Texas Killing Fields, a stretch of land along Interstate 45 near Galveston, had become infamous for unsolved murders of young women. Rhonda and Sharon's case began to be grouped with those disappearances, part of a larger, more terrifying pattern. The community, already fractured by doubt, now faced the possibility that a serial predator had operated in their region for years. Fear returned. Trust in the justice system eroded further, and the truth remained elusive. Michael Lloyd Self died in prison in the year 2000. He was 61 years old. He had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars, maintaining his innocence until the end. His death closed one chapter of the story, but it resolved nothing. Advocates who had fought for his exoneration mourned the loss of a man they believed had been wrongfully convicted. Others felt he had received justice for a horrific crime. The divide was as wide in death as it had been in life. Meanwhile, Edward Harold Bell remained incarcerated, his confession still unproven, still uncharged. He aged behind bars, giving occasional interviews, repeating his claims. Some investigators continued to believe him. Others dismissed him as a manipulator seeking infamy. The case remained in limbo, neither solved nor unsolved, suspended between competing narratives. Families of the victims continued to grieve, caught between the conviction of one man and the confession of another. They wanted closure, but closure required certainty, and certainty was the one thing no one could provide. In 2019, Edward Harold Bell died in prison at the age of 79. He had never been charged with the murders of Rhonda Johnson or Sharon Shaw. His confessions remained sealed in case files, analyzed but never tested in court. His death meant that whatever truth he carried, if any, died with him. The families received the news with conflicting emotions. Relief that a confessed killer was gone. Frustration that he had never faced trial. And the persistent, haunting question, was he telling the truth? Investigators who had believed Bell felt vindicated by patterns in his statements. Those who doubted him saw his death as the end of a distraction. The case, once marked as solved due to self-conviction, was now being listed in some databases as unsolved. The status of the investigation became ambiguous, reflecting the ambiguity of the evidence itself. The community, now decades removed from the original crime, still remembered. The names Rhonda and Sharon remained part of local memory, symbols of loss and unresolved justice. Modern analysts began reevaluating the case with fresh eyes. Forensic experts noted the absence of a confirmed cause of death, the contradictions in Self's confession, and the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime. Legal scholars examined the interrogation methods used in 1972, methods that would not be acceptable under current standards. The involvement of officers later convicted of bank robbery raised red flags about the integrity of the investigation. Advocacy groups focused on wrongful convictions cited the case as an example of systemic failure. Pressure to solve a high-profile crime, leading to reliance on a flawed confession. Yet the conviction stood. No court had overturned it. No exoneration had been granted. The case existed in a legal gray area, officially solved but functionally unresolved. Some official records now listed it among the unsolved cases of the Texas killing fields, grouped with other disappearances that bore similar patterns. The truth, if it existed, was buried beneath layers of doubt, corruption, and time. The Texas killing fields became a phrase synonymous with horror and mystery. Dozens of young women had disappeared or been murdered along the Gulf Coast between the 1970s and 1990s. Many cases remained unsolved. Rhonda and Sharon's story became part of that larger narrative, their names listed alongside others who had vanished into the marsh and heat. Investigators continued to search for connections, patterns, and suspects. Some believed a single predator was responsible. Others argued that the cases were unrelated, separated by time and geography. The truth was likely somewhere in between, a mix of individual crimes and opportunistic killers operating in a region where bodies could disappear easily. The marsh preserved nothing. The water erased evidence. The passage of time made memory unreliable. Families of the victims formed support networks, sharing grief and frustration. They attended hearings, pushed for new investigations, and refused to let the cases fade into obscurity. Their persistence kept the stories alive, ensuring that the names of the lost were not forgotten. The legacy of Rhonda and Sharon's case extended beyond their deaths. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confession-based convictions, the consequences of investigative pressure, and the fragility of justice when corruption infiltrates the process. Legal reform advocates pointed to the case when arguing for better interrogation standards, mandatory recording of interviews, and independent review of confessions. The families, now older, still carried the weight of unanswered questions. They had lived through decades of hope, despair, conviction, doubt, and lingering uncertainty. Some believed Self was guilty. Others believed Bell was the true killer. Some believed neither man was responsible, that the real predator had never been identified. The community had moved on in practical terms. New generations grew up unaware of the case. The beach remained a place of family outings. The marsh continued to shift with the tides. But for those who remembered, the absence of truth remained a wound. Justice, they learned, was not always a verdict. Sometimes it was the absence of one. Researchers and journalists continued to investigate, driven by the same questions that had haunted the case for decades. They reviewed trial transcripts, interviewed retired detectives, and examined Bell's letters. Some traveled to the sites where the girls were last seen and where their remains were found, standing in the heat and humidity, trying to understand how two lives could vanish so completely. They spoke with family members who shared memories of Rhonda and Sharon, their laughter, their dreams, their ordinary teenage lives cut short. The families had aged, but the grief remained fresh, preserved by the lack of closure. They showed photographs, school pictures, birthday parties, moments frozen in time. These were not just victims. They were daughters, friends, sisters. The investigation had reduced them to evidence and testimony, but the families remembered them as people. That memory became the most powerful form of justice, not legal, not final, but deeply human. It was a refusal to let time erase what had been lost. The case also exposed the limitations of the justice system. Courts operate on rules, procedures, and precedents. They require evidence, standards, and burdens of proof. But truth does not always fit neatly into those structures. Sometimes truth is fragmented, contradictory, and incomplete. The conviction of Michael Lloyd Self met the legal standard. The confession was deemed admissible. The trial was conducted according to procedure. But the doubts persisted because the evidence was weak, the confession was inconsistent, and the officers involved were corrupt. The legal outcome did not align with the factual reality, and that misalignment created a space where uncertainty thrived. Edward Harold Bell's confessions added another layer of complexity. His statements were credible enough to be investigated, but not strong enough to prosecute. The result was a case that existed in two states simultaneously, solved and unsolved, closed and open. The families lived in that liminal space, unable to move forward because the past refused to settle. Decades after the crime, the Texas Gulf Coast remained much the same. The beaches still drew tourists. The marshlands still stretched wide and murky. The towns grew, populations shifted, but the landscape endured. On quiet evenings when the wind moved across the water and the sun dipped below the horizon, it was possible to imagine two girls walking along the shore, laughing, unaware of what was coming. That image lingered in the collective memory of the community, a ghost of innocence and normalcy. The case had become part of the region's identity, a reminder of vulnerability and the limits of justice. It was referenced in schools during safety talks, discussed in local history projects, and featured in true crime retrospectives. The story refused to fade because it refused to resolve. And in that refusal, there was a kind of power. The power of memory to outlast silence. The power of questions to outlast answers. Some investigators who had worked the case in its early years look back with regret. They had done what they believed was right at the time, following leads, building a case, securing a conviction, but the corruption revelation and Bell's confessions complicated their legacy. They wondered if they had missed something, if they had been too eager to close the case, if the pressure to deliver justice had compromised their judgment. Others stood by their work, insisting that Self was guilty and that Bell's confessions were false. The debate continued in private conversations, in interviews, and in documentary footage. Retired detectives spoke carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed, every claim scrutinized. They carried the weight of the case differently, some with pride, some with doubt, some with a quiet, unspoken sorrow. The case had shaped their careers, defined their reputations, and left marks that time could not erase. For the families, the passage of time brought no relief. Birthdays came and went, unmarked by celebration. Anniversaries of the disappearance and discovery passed in silence. Holidays felt incomplete. The absence of Rhonda and Sharon was a presence in itself, a constant reminder of what had been stolen. Family members aged, some passing away without ever knowing the full truth. The grief became generational, passed down to children who never met the victims but grew up hearing their names. The families gathered occasionally, sharing stories, supporting one another, finding strength in collective memory. They attended vigils, participated in cold case advocacy, and spoke to journalists who continued to cover the story. Their persistence was not about vengeance, it was about truth. They wanted to know, with certainty, what had happened to the girls they loved. That knowledge, they believed, was owed to them, but it remained just out of reach. The case of Rhonda Renee Johnson and Sharon Lynn Shaw remains unresolved in every way that matters. Officially, Michael Lloyd Self was convicted. Unofficially, Edward Harold Bell confessed. Factually, neither conclusion offers certainty. The cause of death was never confirmed. The true killer was never definitively identified. The evidence was insufficient. The confessions were contradictory. And so the case exists in perpetual suspension, a question without an answer, a wound without healing. The families continue to grieve, the community continues to remember, and the Texas Gulf Coast continues to hold its secrets beneath the water and the marsh. On the shoreline where the girls were last seen, the wind moves through the reeds, carrying whispers of the past. The question lingers in the air, unanswered and unending. Was justice ever served? The truth, if it exists, remains submerged, waiting for a revelation that may never come. The case stays open, not in law, but in memory. Law, but in memory. Law, but in memory. Law, but in memory.